Okay, I hope you all are enjoying your lunch. Our final speaker is Sam Arbesman, who will be discussing his book, Technology at the Limits of Comprehension. So he's a complexity scientist, something that I hope he'll take a few minutes to define for us, whose work focuses on the nature of scientific and technological change. He's currently a scientist in resident at Lux Capital, a venture capital firm focused on ideas at the frontier of science and technology. He's also a senior fellow at the Silicon Flatiron Center and a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. His research has been cited widely and has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He's been a contributing writer to Wired, has had essays about science, mathematics, and technology in places like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and was featured in the Best Writing on Mathematics 2010. I don't know how much best writing in mathematics it is, but he's the author of 2 award-winning books. One of them is this one that we'll hear about momentarily, and the other one is the Half-Life of Facts. So, Sam.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It is great to be here. And related to the best writing on mathematics, it could have been that it was really not any sort of actually, like there was no actually trying to choose people. It was just all 8 people who wrote about math, we got in. But anyway, there it is. So I'm going to be speaking about technology at the limits of comprehension, about my book, Overcomplicated. And so first, I'd like to begin with a few examples about complex technology. So first, theoretically, we will start. Let's see. This seems to be... Yeah, this seems to happen often when I talk about this topic. Okay. Okay. We're back. Great, okay. Okay, so let's first start talking about airplanes. So one of the more important things that airplanes need to do is avoid crashing into each other in the air, which is a fairly important task. And so in order to help pilots achieve this kind of thing, there's a system known as TCAS that's been developed. And the way it works is that depending on the specific situation or specific rules, the TCAS system will inform the pilot whether to pull up, pull down, move out of the way in order to avoid actually crashing. The problem is that while this sounds fairly straightforward, the TCAS system is actually complex that no one fully understands it. It turns out because of the complexity of all the different situations and the exceptions of saying this, but except for this, unless this other situation, you end up with this incredibly complex set of rules. And so maybe only a handful of people at this time on the planet really fully understand the system. And experts who work with TCAS, they're often regularly surprised by its behavior when they're simulating it. So in fact, actually, in order to build a new TCAS system, you essentially almost treat it like a black box. You say, okay, here's a given set of inputs, and here's the desired set of outputs. And if the inputs map onto the outputs, then we're good to go, and you put it into production. And you don't really understand what's going on inside it. And this is kind of surprising, given that lives are actually literally on the line. So let's take another example from a very different area, which is back in a situation that happened in 2015. So back in July 8th, 2015, the New York Stock Exchange went down for a little while, for several hours during the middle of the day. But it turned out this was actually not the only thing that went wrong that day. In addition to the New York Stock Exchange going down, United grounded its airplanes for a little while, and the Wall Street Journal's website, WSJ.com, also went down. And because of the confluence of these 3 events, people kind of went crazy. I don't know if any of you were following Twitter at the time, but it was bedlam. People were saying it was some sort of coordinated cyber attack. They said maybe it was China, maybe it was due to the group Anonymous. There were some people speculating it was the Batman villain Bane, but it was not. It was not any of these things. It turns out it was really just a lot of buggy code that no one fully understood, and it led to these 3 systems going down. So here's another example. The world of deep learning and machine learning and neural networks and artificial intelligence. We're living in this era with all these different systems, and they're great. They're really powerful. They work really well. They allow us to do lots of different things. We can identify objects and images. We can use these systems to help cars drive by themselves or understand spoken language. But here's the thing. Even though the algorithms that allow these systems to learn are well understood, The resulting systems, with their millions of parameters and this kind of complex relationship to the massive, enormous amounts of data that are poured into it, are not fully understood. We don't really know what's going on under the hood of these systems. And so when this happens, we can often be surprised, and sometimes even the people who created these systems can be surprised by their behavior because they don't fully understand what's going on. So we have the system like the Microsoft chatbot Tay, which was designed to act like a teenage girl and instead became a white supremacist, which obviously was not what Microsoft intended, or at least I hope it wasn't. So that was another kind of situation where we have technologies that are not quite fully understandable. But we don't need to go to kind of the realm of self-driving cars. We can actually just look at regular cars, which in fact have huge amounts of computer code within them. So we had the situation a number of years ago where certain vehicles manufactured by Toyota suffered from what was euphemistically referred to as unintended acceleration, which was the problem where certain cars would just periodically accelerate uncontrollably, and some of these cars would crash, and some of these cars actually cause people to die. And so this is actually a very serious problem. So the question is, why did this happen? Why was there this unintended acceleration? And it turns out we're not entirely certain. It now simply seems that due to the incredible complexity of the system, in this case the poor design that actually made it more overly complex, that was probably the reason. But it's not clear if there was a specific single cause. Rather, it was simply that it's more likely than not that the overall complexity and poor design led to this outcome. And in fact, there's a certain inevitability to this kind of thing, that when a system becomes too complex, this is the kind of problem you're going to get, which is a little concerning. So what is the end result? What is the end result of all this? So here is the title of a paper, Abrupt Rise of New Machine Ecology Beyond Human Response Time. So this is referring to high-frequency trading, but this kind of sentiment seems to be throughout a lot of technological systems, whether or not we're dealing with the financial world or not, that humans almost seem to be on the sidelines. There are these fantastically complex systems all interacting among themselves, and we just kind of watch them. We built these technological systems, but now we no longer can fully understand them. And of course, these kinds of things, they're not just at the edges of our experience with enormously complex things like rapid financial systems or certain types of vehicles. This is everywhere. So here's a quote about a Windows desktop machine, which is, it's so complex that no one person on earth really knows what all of it is doing or how. And this kind of thing is symptomatic of the more wide-ranging problem, which is that when it comes to technology, we are moving towards incomprehensibility. And not just for each of us, where we might not understand how the smartphone in our pockets works, but rather the experts, the people who built these systems or who work with them on a daily basis. So in the words of the computer scientist Danny Hillis, we've moved from the Enlightenment, when we could apply our rationality to really understand the world around us, when we can kind of understand everything, to the entanglement, where everything is so hopelessly interconnected, we no longer fully understand the world of our own making around us. And so hopefully I've made this somewhat clear that there's domain after domain, from finance, cars, software, that we're living in this entanglement. That being said, I don't completely want to scare everyone, although actually when I was writing the book, my editor did want me to scare people, at least in the beginning of the book, so that they would kind of continue to read. But I do think there are ways of handling this new era of incomprehensibility. But first, before we get to those ways of handling it, we need to answer a more fundamental question, which is, how did we get here? What are the forces that lead us ever closer to complexity and incomprehensibility when it comes to our technologies? I mean, we think of ourselves as reasonably rational creatures, and so therefore maybe we should be building logical constructions. But it turns out we don't. We end up building these very complicated things that we don't fully understand. So what are these forces? So the first force is that of accretion, this idea that we add parts and sophistication and features to a system over time, which makes sense. And so, so on the left, you have the original airplane from the Wright brothers, and then on the right, you have a modern jet airliner. There's clearly many, many more parts that have been added over time. That being said, the Wright brothers airplane is not hidden within the airplane somewhere, and they've just been adding bits and pieces over time. But very often, in terms of how we build our systems, that is exactly what we do. We add features and parts and components over time, and we end up with a huge number of pieces within some large technology. And so you can see this in the software world, where if you just look at just a very rough proxy, the number of lines of computer code within software. So here is a version of Microsoft Windows, and you can see that the number of lines of code has grown. In fact, has actually grown faster than linearly. And this trend actually occurs in many, many software packages that you look at. Over time, they grow. in just size. These things accrete. And oftentimes when it comes to software, it almost feels like they kind of just like expand to fill the size of our hard drives. As our hard drives get bigger, software also gets bigger. So what is the end result? The end result is that we end up with situations like legacy code and legacy systems where things accrete over time and the old parts still remain. We build this kind of new upon the old, sometimes with components that are years or decades or sometimes even up to a century old, where the original parts are not necessarily fully understood and yet are still essential for making everything work. So for example, the IRS still uses systems from the Kennedy administration. Or in the space program, the space shuttle's final flight was still using computers that are nothing compared to the power of a smartphone, and in fact were decades old at the time. When it turns out floppy disks are still being used for the nuclear program of the United States. And these are not small floppy disks, these are actually the really, really big floppy disks. There was a report saying that hopefully this was going to be phased out in the next few years. I'm fairly skeptical of that. But overall, when we look at these big complex systems, that we end up seeing these kind of legacy situations where new is built upon the old with the end result of a big system that works, at least for the most part until it doesn't, but no one might fully understand it anymore. So the original designers, they might be long retired or even dead. Someone I know who, he's now a philosopher of science, but in a previous life he worked as a computer programmer at a government lab. He told me that he would periodically come across snippets of code with comments around it saying, do not touch this, no one knows what this does. And this is far from the exception. This is a very common kind of thing where we have lots and lots of computer code or lots and lots of technological components where they're foundational and they're very, very important, and yet we don't know what they do. So that's kind of the force of accretion. But this is kind of goes along with another force, which is that of interaction. This idea that systems do not exist in a vacuum. They interact with other systems. Similarly, as systems accrete over time, as you add bits and pieces over time, as you add a single feature, it doesn't also exist by itself. It can interact with everything that has come before it. And so you end up having, not only do systems grow over time, but they also end up becoming more and more complex and more interactive. And so to see an example of this, I'm going to take an example of a system that we don't often think of technology, but which is the law. The rules and regulations in our legal systems, they are a type of technology in some sort of sense. They're a built system for a specific purpose, in this case, to order interactions in society. And these things also interact over time. When you add a new law or rule or regulation, it does not exist in a vacuum. It might work, but it might have unintended or not fully understood consequences. There's the situation of regulatory accumulation where lots and lots of pieces grow over time and you end up with things that are not fully intended. And it turns out not only does the law kind of grow over time in this kind of interactive and accretive fashion, but you can actually look at it as a technological system more traditionally. So some people have done computational analysis of the US code. And they found that just like the world of software, it is also massively complex. And so according to this analysis, it's 22 million words long, and it has 80,000 connections between one part and another. And so it's enormously complicated. And it turns out, whether or not you're looking at just the law, or a piece of software, or a mechanical system, all of these things have a huge number of interactions. And these interactions, alongside accretion, make these systems very complex. Another force is that of edge cases. And so the way to think about this is that the world is complex, and so therefore, in order to handle this complex world, the systems we build also they also have to be of a similar order of complexity. So for example, let's say you wanted to build a calendar application for your phone or your desktop computer. So you would say, okay, this is actually fairly straightforward. We'll just have 365 days in the year, done. But of course, you have to deal with leap years. So you have to hard code that little rule inside to deal with leap years. But then you also need to deal with time zones and daylight savings time, and suddenly all the different exceptions and complications of the real world end up making the system very, very complex. And you can also see this in the world of self-driving cars, where it's one matter, it's not trivial, but it's a lot easier to say, okay, I'm going to build a car that can drive on a highway in sunny conditions with very few cars around it. It's another thing to say, okay, maybe I need to deal with one-way streets, pedestrians, pets darting out in the middle of the road, other cars being driven by highly irrational people. Suddenly, all of these exceptions and edge cases mean that you end up building a much, much more complex system. So these forces of accretion, interaction, handling edge cases, each one is a fairly it's reasonable. Like each individual design decision makes sense. You want to add sophistication and a new feature to a system. You want to make sure a system can interact with other systems or pass information from one component to another. You want to actually make sure that a system handles the full force of complexity of the real world. They all make sense, but over time, they all combine to make our systems ever more complex. But the question is, why do these systems not just become more complex over time, but actually become incomprehensible? And so the easiest way to think about it is that it turns out our brains break down in the face of this kind of complexity. There's a gap. We actually fail to understand. And the main reason is because complex systems are built in ways that make them hard to think about. And so there's kind of this disconnect between how we build our systems and the kind of systems that we're actually good at thinking about. And so one of the ways we can kind of see where our brains break down is through the example of recursion in terms of language. So there's recursion in computer science, but there's also recursion in terms of language, the idea that you could embed one sentence within another. So for example, you can say, he said that the dog is brown. You can also say, she thought that he said that the dog is brown. Or, I remembered that she thought that he said that the dog is brown. Embedding one sentence within another. And it turns out, and you don't have to do this very many times before it becomes hard to figure out what's going on. And even though language is effectively infinite, you can do this as many times as you want, beyond really a handful of embeddings, you can't handle it. But of course, computers needn't be bothered with this kind of thing. So here's a sentence that a computer can parse. This is the cheese that the rat, that the dog chased bit ate. We can't hold this all in our heads. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't even quite look like a normal sentence. But it turns out not only is it grammatically correct, it makes sense. Computers can handle this, and machines are fine, and yet we break down. It turns out there's a whole bunch of different things that obviously computers are good at in terms of cognitive power that we are bad at. So recursion, we can handle far less than 10 levels. Computers can handle millions of levels. Working memory, maybe only a few chunks of information. Computers obviously a lot more than that. We suck at multitasking. Computers are pretty good at it. The speed of neurons is very slow. Computers are much faster. Storage capacity, there's a lot of different estimates about this. But whether or not we're better or worse than computers, it's going to be eclipsed fairly rapidly. But ultimately, what it turns out is that our brains break down in the face of massive, complex systems with their huge number of interactions and their nonlinear feedback. So it turns out the kinds of things we need to really understand our complex technologies are the kind of things that we are precisely not evolved to think about. So we end up failing. And so we're not able to handle these systems. They seem somewhat incomprehensible. What do? How do we handle all this comprehensibility when it comes to our complex technological systems? So one response is that of Kelvin and his father. So when you're kind of looking at a vacuum cleaner or a light bulb or some other technology you don't fully understand, you just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, it's magic. This is not the best approach to kind of just throw your hands up in the air and shrug. I feel like this is a certain abdication of our responsibility to understand. So what do? How do we handle this? So now we're going to move a little bit more into the philosophy of technology. So what I've set up until now, it could actually sound like a lot of bad news. I happen to be, though, a fairly happy person by disposition. So saying we're screwed is not an answer that I'm comfortable with. And I think there are ways of actually meeting our technologies halfway. And so one way to do this is to look at the structure of our technologies and see whether or not there are comparable systems. And maybe we can learn something from the people who actually understand these comparable systems. So when we discuss complex technological systems, we often refer to them as complex and messy, systems that have evolved over time, have a lot of legacy code, almost an organic level of complexity. We're using the kind of terminology that biologists often use to describe biological systems. And in fact, while this looks almost like a circuit, this is in fact actually the metabolic pathways within a cell. So maybe we should actually take this analogy seriously. If we're approaching biology in level of complexity in terms of our technologies, maybe what we can do is actually look at how biologists think about complex biological systems and use the same sort of techniques to query them. So in other words, essentially become field biologists for technology. So George Dyson, a historian of technology, he actually used a similar kind of term of digital biologists. So whether or not we're digital biologists or field biologists kind of exploring the world of technology, what does this mean? What sort of techniques do you need to use to become a field biologist for technology? And so one technique is that of learning from bugs. So you can kind of think of this as like the naturalists of old. Before they could necessarily understand even like evolution, kind of the connectedness of everything, what they would do is they would simply just go out and collect insects or butterflies and kind of begin to organize and classify information. And the same kind of thing can be applied to the technological world, that when a system is too complex to fully understand, what you can do is kind of slowly but surely examine the details and begin to classify parts and slowly but surely build a more complete picture. But you can also take this a little bit more literally and actually learn from and collect bugs or glitches or failures. You can actually look at computer bugs and technological bugs. Because it turns out when a system is so complex, sometimes the only way to actually get insight into how it works is when something goes wrong. So what does this mean? What would that look like? So 7 years ago, there was something that was called the Boston water emergency. So I was living in Boston at the time, and what happened was there was this pipe that was for a reservoir that was serving the Boston metropolitan area. It burst, and because of that, the whole metropolitan area of Boston was not able to have, I guess, good quality water. They weren't able. There was a backup reservoir. They weren't able to ensure the quality of the water. So they said, okay, everyone needs to boil their water. And so I was living in Brookline at the time, which is actually not in Boston. It's surrounded by Boston on 3 sides. But I was part of this boil water order. But what was kind of surprising when this happened was that one of the few places that was not subject to this was Cambridge. Cambridge, kind of across the river from Boston, even though it was surrounded by towns and cities that had to boil their water, they did not have to do that because it turns out they received their water from an independent source that was fine. And so prior to this failure happening, I did not know where my water came from or where Cambridge's water came from. I learned something. Now, in this case, the people who were working on the city were well aware of this, at least I hope, but I learned something from this. But it turns out oftentimes when we're confronted with failures and bugs, even the experts actually end up learning something about the system that they created. They actually discover that there's a gap between how the system, how they thought it was going to act and how it actually does act. So you can see this in computer chess. In this case, this is the case of Deep Blue playing Garry Kasparov. So at one point during the match between Kasparov and Deep Blue, there was a situation where it made a certain move, and it said, and outside analysts were divided over a mysterious move made by the program, thinking it either weak or obliquely strategic. And so it was this kind of curious situation, almost like a bug of sorts, and it turns out they began to try to figure out, okay, was this a really good move? Was this a bad move? What was going on? And it turns out it wasn't anything really impressive on the part of the machine. It actually was a glitch. But of course, this bug in turn led to further insight into the system. But we don't need to wait simply for bugs to arise. What we can actually do is inject errors into our system in order to learn. So going back to the world of biology, let's say you want to try to understand how genes function. You can irradiate bacteria and actually introduce mutations into their systems and look at how mutations affect the system and learn about how genes function or certain metabolic pathways. This process is known as mutagenesis, actually kind of generating and injecting mutations through radiation or various chemicals. And this is actually a very well-studied approach for figuring out how these very complex systems work. And you can do the same kind of things in the world of technology. So Netflix has developed a computer software package known as Chaos Monkey, where what it does is it periodically just randomly takes down various systems and subsystems in order to make sure that the system is as robust as possible, but also make sure for the engineers that there's as small a difference as possible between how they think it should operate when something goes wrong and how it actually does operate. And similarly, people who work with supercomputers have actually injected errors into the systems and like flipped bits randomly, and to see whether or not these kinds of errors actually matter. Because the system is so complex, they don't really know, and they need to actually use the errors in order to learn about the system. And we can also look to how ecologists think about ecological systems in order to understand technologies. So if you're an ecologist or a field biologist, you don't, when you're confronted with an ecosystem, you don't try to understand all of it at once. You don't say, okay, I'm going to understand the thousands or millions of species within some ecosystem and all of their interactions. Rather, what you do is you look at 2 different species and how they interact, or 3 different species, and slowly but surely build a more complete picture of what's going on in the ecosystem. And you can take this kind of similar tinkering approach to the world of technology. So for example, when you're confronted with a complex AI or machine learning system, and you're not really sure exactly what's going on under the hood, what you can do is you can look at parts and kind of slowly but surely build a complete picture or inject certain types of data and see how it responds to those changes and slowly figure out how the actual system works as a whole. Anyway, these are a couple approaches of what it might mean to be a field biologist for technology. But in addition to biological thinking, more practically, we can also think about how to understand our technologies, even if only incompletely, by looking to the history of technology. So this is the Commodore VIC-20. It's from the 1980s. The pitchman, William Shatner, referred to it as the wonder computer of the 1980s. This was actually the first computer that my family had. It connected to your television. It used like audio cassettes to save information. I think it had 5K of RAM. It was very basic, but it was wonderful. But one of the ways you would get computer programs for the Commodore VIC-20, you could purchase cassettes with the computer programs. But in addition to that, you could also use something known as type-ins. So you could buy a computer magazine, and in the back there would just be pages and pages of computer code that you would just manually enter in, or you would type them in. And this was a way to actually get computer programs to work. And so at the time when we had this, I didn't know how to program yet. I was a little kid, but I could see a very clear relationship between the text that you were entering and the resulting output, sometimes buggy, sometimes not, of what was actually going on the screen. There was this very clear relationship. There was almost this gateway to understanding of what was going on. There was this very small distance between the machine and at least having some understanding of what was actually happening. Of course, things have changed. We now have very slick pieces of technology. Like we've come a little bit more detached. We have the iPad, which is just, I guess, essentially slick metal and glass, where it's very sophisticated, can do lots of different things, but we often don't really know what's going on inside it. I actually have almost no idea of how files are stored within the iPad or the iPhone. There's really no ability to kind of peek under the hood until sometimes when things go wrong, and then some of the hidden complexity is revealed. But too often we don't have really any way of understanding what is going on underneath our very, very complex technologies. And so when this happens, you can end up with really, really weird situations. So here's a quote. This is from the Wall Street Journal. I'll show up next. This is soon after the Apple Watch came out, where people were comparing the Apple Watch versus mechanical watches. And so this one person was quoted saying, when I wear a mechanical watch, I think of the precision required to make it work on such a micro scale. That's pretty awesome, as opposed to just a chip. Now, I will not deny that a mechanical watch requires a great deal of craftsmanship. But I mean, that's not the point. I mean, these systems, they're orders of magnitude more complex than a mechanical watch. But the problem is that the Apple Watch and kind of the mechanism within these kind of technologies is hidden. And so therefore, people have no idea what's going on underneath. And so therefore, what we need, another way to kind of think about how to meet our technologies halfway, is to have ways of uncovering the complexity within these technologies, almost gateways to our machine, in order to kind of more explicitly see the incomprehensible world that we actually live in. And so this can be as simple as a progress bar, where it just kind of shows you where various packages are being installed when you're installing something. I'll admit that progress bars are sometimes, best case, tenuously connected to what's actually happening. But these are the kind of things we need more of, or the ability to actually kind of have a command line within your Macintosh computer or whatever computer you have. These kind of systems, these windows, these gateways, provide at least a little bit of understanding. Because ultimately, understanding, whether it's technology or not, it's not this binary condition of complete understanding or complete mystery. There's a spectrum, and these gateways to our technologies can help, even if only to just make you as a user aware of the massive complexity of the technologies that we use every day. We need these better ways of uncovering this kind of complexity. And if we can't do that, we at least need a certain amount of technological humility. So too often when we're confronted with a very, very complex technology, we veer towards one of two extremes. We either have a certain fear in the face of the unknown, or we have almost this veneration of, almost this religious veneration of our technological systems. We say, okay, we freak out and say self-driving cars are going to kill us all, or we say, oh, the mind of Google is so beautiful, it's going to do all these wonderful things. And of course, it's not beautiful and perfect. It's built by imperfect beings. It's built by us. And these two extremes are not healthy. So what we need is something in between. In this case, I'd like to say that humility is that happy medium, because it's actually also more productive. It's this recognition that we should continue to try to understand these systems as best we can, but if we fail, that's okay, because these systems are extremely complex. Every single thing. And actually, when it comes to science, in certain areas, maybe in kind of very esoteric areas of physics, we are beginning to against our limits to understanding. And I think we might need to actually, for the technological realm. In this case, even for the technologies that we ourselves have built, as long as, of course, it is a productive humility that doesn't cut off questioning, but actually recognizes that it's okay to have limits. And you can see this kind of thing, and actually can be quite productive. Because it can even allow us to work in partnership with machines that can help us understand our systems when we can't fully understand them. So this is a blog post from Google. This is several years ago. They've actually done some more sophisticated things since then, where they were looking at the data centers and trying to optimize them, and they realized that the people who were working on it couldn't fully understand it. So they began to apply various machine learning techniques onto these systems. And they said, one thing computers are good at is seeing the underlying story in the data. So Jim, the guy they're talking about, took the information we gather in the course of our daily operations and ran it through a model to help make sense of complex interactions that his team, being mere mortals, may not otherwise have noticed. And so they recognized that it was okay to not fully understand these systems because we could create systems that could in turn help us to understand these technologies. Now, the weird thing about this is sometimes the technologies that we build to actually help us understand our other technologies themselves might not be fully understandable, which is a little weird, and some people might actually be a little bit concerned about this. But actually related to that, if that is concerning, in addition to humility, I think we can also use another response, which is that of nachas. So this is a Yiddish term. It means emotional gratification or pride, especially taken vicariously at the achievements of one's children. So you have nachas, so the term is you shep nachas at graduations, weddings, bar mitzvahs. These are not necessarily your own accomplishments, but you can still have pride and joy in the accomplishments of others. And I think we might actually need to think about applying nachas to our technologies. When these systems are doing things that we are not able to do, we can still take pride in them. I mean, we have technological systems that can do things in the realm of creativity. They can create innovations. They can run complex systems like the data centers in Google. They can make scientific discoveries or create scientific hypotheses that we can then test. They can even generate music or art. And so even though those resulting creations are not our own, the systems that we created, these are ours. And so even if we didn't fully understand them, that's okay, because we built them. And we can still have a certain amount of nachas in them. Now maybe this sounds, it could definitely sound a little hopelessly naive, but I do think this is a lot more productive than the alternative of just simply being gravely concerned at the situation of not fully understanding our technologies. So where do we go from here? It's true, we're going to find ourselves bumping up against our limits to comprehend our technologies more and more, as we recognize more clearly that we are living in this entanglement, this era of incomprehensibility. I mean, this world is here, whether we want it or not. But I think if we're conscious and aware of the fact that we're living in this entanglement, we can plan for it and be a little bit more humble in the face of this. Because if not, it's going to be happening anyway, and we're simply going to be blindsided by our failure to understand. And so once we recognize this, I think we can thrive in this era, whether it's kind of having this humble tinkering approach to technology, building gateways to our machine, as well as learning to think more like biologists as our systems themselves become more biological in their complexity. The overcomplicated realm, it doesn't need to be faced with fear, but rather, I'd like to think, with a sense of delight and adventure. So, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions. We got one over there.
That was just marvelous.
Thank you.
And I'm an economist, and I say that everything you said applies to the economy. It's a complex system. It's becoming more complex and has been over the last few centuries. And exactly the advice that you give, this kind of optimistic, appreciative humility, this field biology approach, is, I think, the correct way of thinking about the economy. The optimism of the early 19th century that we could control everything, this residue of the Enlightenment, the rational side of the Enlightenment, is in conflict with the freedom side of the Enlightenment. And so I congratulate you, and I urge you to speak to economists about this.
Thank you very much.
Because everything that you say applies to the economy.
Oh, I appreciate it. And actually, I think in a lot of these, I didn't discuss it that much in the book, but when it comes to large social systems, a lot of these things in terms of they've evolved over time, there's kind of, and really, you mentioned about kind of complexity science, and complexity science is really the approach of saying, okay, there's a lot of big complex systems, these systems that have a huge number of interacting parts, and it turns out whether or not it's in biology, technology, certain social systems like societies or economies, there are certain fundamental regularities and similarities to them, and ideally, you can actually study them in similar ways, which is pretty gratifying.
Kevin Taylor from Comcast. I'm curious, as you've done this research, what do you think it looks like for us in 10 years, 20 years, and particularly for our children and our grandchildren, as far as how does it impact their lives when you get to a point where you're living in, sort of amongst all of these very complicated systems that arguably have become more and more intelligent, via the machine learning and AI. Any thoughts? Or?
Yeah, so one interesting trend that I've been seeing, and so DARPA has been working on this, and a number of other people have been involved, a lot of researchers, is this trend of saying, okay, a lot of these AI systems, these technologies, they're very sophisticated, but we don't often understand what's going on. And so therefore, we should maybe try to aim towards what people are calling explainable AI, saying, okay, when these systems make decisions, can they at least tell us why these decisions are being made? So for example, and so one of the areas where this would be really important is in the world of self-driving cars, where, and when people are driving cars, you come to an intersection, there's kind of this little dance of maybe who's going to be going first. You have a theory of mind of how people are making decisions. When it comes to these AI systems, even if they might be orders of magnitude safer than people, we don't necessarily have a sense of how they're making their decisions, at least intuitively. And so I think what we need to do in a lot of these systems is figure out how to have a certain number of easily understandable heuristics, or at least a certain amount of explainability when it comes to these technologies. Because I think, if you look at small kids using technologies right now, so my daughter is 4, she has really no problem using like the Amazon Echo, like Alexa. It works half the time for her. She's unbothered by when it doesn't work. She doesn't really think about how it does work and what's going on under the hood. It's just kind of this magical little cylinder. And I think what we need to do, because eventually that generation is going to be living in this world. And so before they do kind of have this almost like unthinking relationship to technology, we need to start thinking more, at least subtly, about kind of this explainability and saying, okay, it's wonderful to have all of these systems, but we need to have a certain way of approaching them. And so the kind of explainability I think of is the AI aspect of kind of these gateways to our machines and understanding, in order to make sure that we at least have some window into what's going on in these systems, because otherwise the only time we end up having a window into what's going on is sometimes when it's too late, when something goes wrong, and then we realize, oh wow, we were giving it hugely biased data in terms of learning, and it was doing something very, very different than what we thought it was doing. And so having that ability for a system to explain how it's making its decisions can, I think, be very powerful. I think that's at least one way of getting towards the good future that I think we want.
That was really fun, and I enjoyed your talk. I'm Diane Bailey from UT Austin. The only quibble I'll have, and it's probably going to be no surprise to anyone in the room, is that I'm a little uncomfortable with maybe a bit of a suggestion that the way that we're going to understand these complicated systems is through AI, and we're going to leave it up to them. And I'll just give 3 examples from engineers who design these complicated problems and how they've dealt with these problems of the complexity. So if you look at hardware engineers who design computer chips and peripherals, they're dealing with hundreds of thousands of gates and other components of the chip, and they've transistors and that kind of thing. They've given up talking about those, and they've risen to a level of abstraction where they talk about information flows, and that's how they understand their product. If you look at structural engineers who design buildings, if you think about rectangular skyscrapers, they can operate on the principle that there's a mirror function here, and they can draw a 45-degree line and cut their complexity problem in half. They can use shortcuts and rules of thumbs that tell them something about how the load's going to transfer through the building, so they don't have to deal with that complexity. But if you look at automobiles, the moment you raise the lid, the hood, you can look in and you can see that, hey, all the parts don't look the same, and they had a real problem. They couldn't reduce complexity in the same way. And so their way of dealing with it was to organizationally put the engineers in groups that mimic the products, the components of the car. And that's why automobile companies have maybe 100,000 engineers, but you could build a chip with 100 engineers. So there are some other mechanisms that engineers have developed beyond AI, and I'm just wondering if you saw some other examples of that as you did your research.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you entirely that, yeah, there are a lot of techniques like modularity, certain aspects of abstraction. These kinds of things help reduce complexity and make sure that even though there are these forces that kind of lead things to be ever more complex, we can fight against that. I think more often than not, these end up being kind of losing battles. But I think when you think about complexity, there is this distinction, and I kind of only alluded to this a little bit in the book, but between like the inherent complexity, so like when I'm talking about the edge cases, like these, when the system is very complex, you need to have a certain inherent level of complexity of a system. But then there's kind of the accidental complexity, because the system is built over time and has legacy technologies, that the thing ends up being more complex than it needs to be. And maybe if we ideally could kind of engineer it from the start, we'd be able to reduce that complexity. Sometimes, though, there are a number of kind of forces and incentives that, and time or money, that kind of make it impossible to do that kind of thing. The problem, though, is that when these systems become so complicated, sometimes it's actually difficult to distinguish between when the complexity is inherent to the system and when it's actually accidental. And so that's one of the concerns that I've been thinking about, is that when these systems are so complex, you actually sometimes can't even tell if is it inherent, is this complexity necessary, or is it simply bad design? And you can use abstraction to kind of mitigate some of this. Sometimes the problem with these very complex systems is that details you thought you could abstract away end up kind of rising up in an unexpected fashion. But yeah, no, it's a big problem. And there definitely are techniques to mitigate this, and there are certain programming techniques to drastically reduce the number of bugs in a system. But oftentimes, because we're just imperfect beings and we're subject to constraints of time and money and various other things, we end up building things more complex, and sometimes more complex than they need to be, and this is the world we end up getting. Oh, yeah.
I am Paul Vixie. Thank you very much for your talk. This was excellent. I think you're about to find that I do not share your optimism. I work in the cybersecurity field. I have read and referred many people to that Medium article that you quoted from. In cybersecurity, what we have right now is defenders attempting to defend that which they do not understand. And they keep losing to attackers who understand it better than they do. And so what you'll see here is that the ability to apprehend what a system is doing is directly proportional to your control over it and your safety from it. So in the last 100 years, we have reduced by 99% the number of people who know where their food comes from. And I think I can safely say that most people with an Amazon Echo will never know how it works. And I'm wondering, yes, using AI to explain, adding gateways, these are things which, optimistically speaking, could make the situation less bad. But I don't see that the incentives are aligned in a way to make that happen. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about social policy mechanisms that might be able to help get us onto your optimistic path. Thank you.
Though I agree that in certain areas it's a lot probably more accurate to be pessimistic than optimistic, and sometimes troubling. In terms of social policy, I'm not sure. I actually don't really have any good answers for that. The one thing I would say, and certainly in the cybersecurity area, and I think this is kind of true in many areas, where there's this term from physics. It's this phrase, robust yet fragile. And people refer to both biology and technological systems, this idea that, and especially in the technological realm, that when we build these systems, we build them to be very, very robust. But they're often only robust to all the different failure modes that we can anticipate. And so they're very, very robust, but they can be fragile in the face of anything that's unexpected. And I think simply, so I would say in terms of, I'm not sure policy prescription, but I would say one way to think about design as we kind of think about these systems is simply to make sure that we have as many stakeholders and also as many people from as many different areas as possible coming together to at least weigh in on the design of these systems so that we reduce the number of different kind of fragile, unexpected modes of failure, and in order to kind of make sure it is truly as robust as possible. Now, of course, these systems will often fail or be compromised in some way. This is kind of, there's a certain inevitability to that. But the idea is that if you can have as many people as possible from lots of different diverse backgrounds in different areas weighing in, hopefully you can reduce that and maybe make things fail a little bit more gracefully. Yes.
Hi, Richard Bennett. It seems In my experience doing engineering, which I did for 30 years, mostly network engineering, a lot of times you get excessive complexity in the system because somebody who preceded you in the long path of people who inherited the design and enhanced it, at maybe the first step or the first two steps, they place too high a value on simplicity. Mm-hmm. And so if the essential core design of the system is extremely simple, but you need it to actually do some things that require power and complexity, then the whole system sort of becomes a real Rube Goldberg thing. And where I think what you really need to do to reduce the complexity in the long run is redesign it periodically, refactor the system, change the modularity, and it sort of requires continual maintenance to achieve the goal of simplicity over the long run. And there are some systems we build where it's sort of impossible to do that, like the internet. Mm-hmm. So, gee, is that an impasse?
To a certain degree, yes. And so there's this great book called I think the most recent edition is called System Design, but in previous edition was called System Antics. This idea that systems are prone to antics, and it's this very quirky book where it has kind of a lot of these rules of thumbs and heuristics about systems. And it says one of the points that is made in this book is that even when you design a system to be simple from the ground up, it is going to get complex, and you end up with a complex system. And when you try to replace that with a new, simpler system, it ends up kind of going in the same direction. And so I think we should continue periodically to refactor our systems, redesign them, but oftentimes it is certain amount of like a stopgap measure. But I think the good reason for that, though, is it ensures that people are aware of how the system is designed and also the limitations on trying to actually make it as simple as possible. Because otherwise, people, if it goes for too long, then the new people who confront it say, oh, it should really be a lot simpler. And then, of course, they're naive in the face of actually recognizing that this is an inherently complex thing to work with. Exactly, yes. Okay, what do we have back there?
Excuse me, Peter Pitch. I want to pick up on Professor McCluskey's thoughts about applying this to the economy. Have you thought about what this means for business organization? Economists often talk about vertical integration as being a way to solve complexity problems over time, Oliver Williamson, that kind of thing. And then also sort of how it plays out in the marketplace, because some of the most successful companies in the world are companies that have done better than others in making things simple for a lot of consumers. So have you thought about how this all plays out in the economy?
So I guess I'll take those in kind of the opposite order. So with regard to kind of building things that are simple, you want, I think, and maybe I'll kind of impute too much to a lot of the kind of technology designers, but I think you want to make the systems that kind of have a very simple mode of entry, but you have the option for more complexity, because oftentimes that kind of allows you to kind of slowly interact with the system more and more in a more complex way as you realize you actually want it to do more functionality. So there is a balance, and I think when you make something too simple, and what that too simple is kind of in the eye of the beholder, kind of going back to like make things simple, but not too simple. That's one. Designers have to grapple with that, and of course there's also the difference between kind of the underlying complexity versus kind of the complexity of the user interface, for example. That's another thing to think about. But going back to the first question about complexity of organizations and how to grapple with this, I haven't thought too much about it, but one thing I was thinking is when you think about when a new CEO comes into a company, there's often this desire to kind of make a great deal of changes because that CEO wants to kind of make their mark on an organization. But obviously, any organization is extremely complex. It is an extremely complex system. And so perhaps the kind of approaches I mentioned, like kind of the more biological or almost tinkering approach and kind of a more humble approach to an organization is probably going to be a lot more effective in actually changing a system slowly but surely in the way you want it. That being said, you don't necessarily get the kind of credit as a CEO that you would want. And so I think there is a tension between the kinds of things that people want to do when they come into an organization and the kinds of things you actually should do. And that can be quite problematic sometimes.
Wrap it up now. But thank you so much. That was
Thank you
a
very much.
really wonderful talk. Totally fascinating. It's this year's TPI Aspen Forum. Thank you all for coming and participating. We really appreciate it. But of course, the most important person to thank is Jane Creel, who makes this complex system work. This would not happen without her, and followed by Ashley Benjamin. If you made it here today, it's because of her. And Brandon Silberstein, Wallace Robzak, and Sarah O, who I believe has live tweeted the entire conference. And so we hope that we'll see you back here next year. Those of you who are in DC, we'll see you there. Thank you all very much.